General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
After 2 wars revealed just how small and interconnected our planet had become, the world looked forward with hope to the possibilities of global cooperation and economic prosperity. And as the Aspen Institute was founded in this post-war period, so too was the formation of the World Bank and a global anchor currency, new agreements on tariffs and trade, and a transatlantic military alliance laid the foundation for a global economy like never before.
What we have is incredibly precious. What we have is this incredible, rich civil society and the innovation that the economy produces.
One is the question of why should I be just to anybody else if I am pursuing my own happiness?
We feel powerful, prosperous. We feel we can trade with the whole world or not as we wish.
What we have is a world that we have created since 1945 that is unlike anything before it.
Sometimes in this great, rich country of ours, it must seem we can build anything, that we can grow anything, that we have everything.
And as nations explored different understandings of how to govern and how to prosper, new shocks and challenges arose, testing the system and redefining the balance between markets, governments, and people.
Our aim is to increase our national wealth so all will have more.
Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points.
Traders here working the phone say a lot of their customers are freaked out, waiting to see how low the Dow will go.
Yes, creating great wealth is a good thing, but creating community and the dignity of each individual and each of our neighbors, that's the real thing.
The rapidly changing landscape of industry, policy, systems, and institutions has shifted the way the world looks at the economy in a way that is new, but not novel.
We all matter. We all make contributions. But in order to do that, we need access to the bounty that is America.
The past might not have all the answers for the future, but certain questions remain important to ask.
Maybe we need other metrics too to say, what is an economy actually for? And the more narrow definition is, it's to create growth and wealth. A broader definition is, and this gets back to what Aspen was all about, to create a good society.
I am Laurel Atkinson. I'm the Vice President for Communications and Marketing at the Aspen Institute, and I am thrilled to be here with you today. What we've just watched is a reflection on 75 years of history, a history that reminds us that the Aspen Institute was born in a moment of rebuilding and reimagining. In the aftermath of war, as the world sought new frameworks for peace and prosperity, Aspen was founded to ask one of the most human of questions: what kind of society do we want to build together? Over the decades, Aspen has been intertwined with the defining economic pillars of every era, from industrial expansion to globalization to the rise of digital economies. And through it all, our role has been to convene, to question, and to help leaders shape an economy rooted not just in productivity, but in possibility and shared dignity. That role has never been more important. In this moment of disruption and realignment, when technology and trust and talent are all being redefined, Aspen continues to stand at the intersection of ideas and impact, ensuring that markets serve people and not the other way around. To reflect on the role that institutions have played in our history and what they must do to remain vital in the future, I'm pleased to introduce 2 incredible leaders: Dan Porterfield, President and CEO of the Aspen Institute, and Andrew Sullivan, CEO of Prudential Financial. They'll be in conversation with Jennifer Wallace, co-founder of the Mattering Movement.
Andy and Dan, it's so great to be with you today. I'm going to jump in because I know we are tight on time here. On the clock. Okay. So many enduring institutions begin with a story, someone who saw a problem and set out to solve it. So Dan, I'd like to start with you first. Take us back to the Aspen Institute's founding moment. what was the challenge that they were looking to solve?
Well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you to all who are here and to our partners, Prudential and Andy. As you heard in the video, the founding challenge of those times was that the world had just gone through a period of terrible horror and pain with World War II, the Holocaust, the first uses of nuclear weapons. The individual seemed to be pressed beneath enormous, unresponsive, inhumane systems. And we saw in 1945 onward the rise of communism and also of nuclear proliferation. In that context, many institutions of civil society were formed. And what is civil society? It's the space between business on the one hand and government on the other. And there are some problems and some opportunities that cannot be fully addressed or maximized by business or by government, especially alone. And so this curious grapevine, as Eleanor Roosevelt called it, of organizations and institutions, universities, research entities, youth civic organizations formed after World War II to create a space and a place for the individual to contribute and for communities to be able to bond and renew the sort of spirit of American democracy. The Aspen Institute's role in particular was to foster the dialogue that brings people together, to build understanding and promote new possibilities for a better world.
Oh, amazing. Andy, I grew up in New Jersey but did not know Prudential's origin story, which is really powerful. So I'd love you to tell us a little bit about that founding story.
Yeah, well, so first that tells me we need to do a better job on branding, especially since you grew up in New Jersey. No, it's an amazing story, and it's a privilege to lead such a great organization. So Prudential was founded back in 1875 by a gentleman named John Dryden. And it was really founded on an idea and a purpose that financial security should be in reach of everybody. And literally, John, he went across to England to learn the insurance business, came back, hired some employees, and started going door to door to make sure that the working class had access to burial insurance so that they could both care for their loved ones that had passed with dignity, but also set themselves up for a better go-forward life. So it really was started from a very simple concept of financial security should be within reach for all, and that the company should help people achieve that. And from that very humble beginnings, we're now in 50 countries and serve 50 million people around the world. So it's pretty amazing.
Wow, that's powerful. So let's fast forward to today. As a society, we are in a moment of rapid change, to put it mildly. Dan, let me start with you. What do you see as essential to preserve when you think about Aspen's initial moments? What's essential to preserve, and what needs to change to evolve to meet the moment?
So from that initial founding in 1949, our Big Bang moment, if you will, we've now grown to become a global organization with 13 Aspens in countries all around the world, with more than 30 programs that focus on practical problem solving here in the US and around the world, with fellowship programs that have worked with more than 9,000 leaders, 7 of whom ran for President of the United States in 2020,
wow.
to help them understand both the why and the how of leadership in order to lead more effectively. And a set of public convenings like this one that bring people together to exchange ideas and then go out and make a difference together. And so what needs to stay the same from that story of development is a commitment to dialogue, to practical problem solving, to being an inclusive organization, to almost never working alone, partnering with others together to frame and solve problems. What needs to evolve, of course, is first, we've got to focus on the real problems people are living with right now, today, which includes economic disempowerment, young people not trusting in the institutions of society, and a global order that seems to have become both more unstable on the one hand and more great power dominate on the other. And so what we have to do is evolve our offerings so that we are relevant and responsive to the needs of today.
Thank you. What about you, Andy? What needs to stay the same, what needs to stay rooted, and what needs to evolve?
So I love the use of the word relevant, because if you think about 2025 versus 1875, I mean, customers have changed, society has changed, the economies have changed, and obviously technology has accelerated. So the key is to continue to make sure that we evolve. Our core strength, our core differentiation, what needs to stay the same, it's our talent and our culture as an organization, right? We've been in and out of many businesses through the years. We've been in and out of many markets. But if we always have our people and our culture at the center, and then our purpose and our mission has stayed the same. How do we help people move forward in their financial lives? How do we help them live better lives? As long as you keep that purpose at the center, and you have the right talent, and you have the right cultural environment, you just then need to keep making the right changes to stay relevant for the consumer's needs today.
Let me talk to you a little bit about your deep roots in Newark. Can you share, is there a story that comes to mind about Prudential's connection to place and how it impacts your work?
Well, it's great that we're having this conversation in this setting, in the city of Newark. So we believe deeply that we can do well by doing good, and we need to invest in the communities that we live and work. The communities that we're in are our customers, our employees. So we've believed that from the very, very beginning of really being invested in the places that we are. And Newark is our shining prime example. As we sit in this facility, we were part of helping finance and set the vision for NJPAC from day one. Why? Because it makes for stronger communities. It makes for a better talent pool. It makes for a more vibrant economy. And that's really important in the places that we are.
Dan, Aspen is grounded, as we saw in the video, on the longstanding belief in building a good, just society. Can you talk a little bit about how those values influence your new work at the Center for Rising Generations? I'd love you to talk a little bit about the center and what your goals are.
Thank you, Jenny. I don't want to move too fast, though, past Newark and Prudential, because what this company has done is a model for companies and civic institutions all around the world. There are not that many institutions that have chosen to stay in their place of founding. And when you think about the power of being an anchor institution, a sort of a civic asset for a community, Prudential and Newark go hand in hand. Even as you become a global financial services company, Newark stays at the core. And I think in an era of globalization and expansion, if institutions don't have a home base that they're committed to, then all that work that we do to spread our wings and to spread our ideas nevertheless becomes a bit hollow. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Someday there's going to be a book written about the institutions that made, I'll call it the choice, because you have to choose to stay. The New Orleans Saints might be there with you because they stayed after Katrina. It makes such a difference.
Well, it does become part of the organization's DNA.
Exactly. The employees are committed to the place they live, they raise their children, the neighborhoods in which they spend their time. And so thank you again. And then that's part of what we have to do as a country, of course, is to strengthen the bonds of community in place. And we are working in a time when there are so many other forces, especially through technology, that are dividing people, creating camps and factions, and us versus them. So last year, with a gift from Mike and Jackie Bezos, who were the first investors in Amazon, we founded and endowed a Center for Rising Generations at the Aspen Institute. And this is a center that will ensure that for the rest of our history, we will always have the funding to include youth and young adults in everything we do. We recruited Kaya Henderson, the former leader of the Washington, D.C. Public Schools, to build the center. We're 1 year in now. The vision of the center is that we want to partner with anyone who will work with us to make civil dialogue, civic engagement, and developing your leadership a predictable part of growing up in this country and around the world. And I think every institution needs to take the lens of rising generations and to see how can we make sure that we are bringing to the table and to the boardroom and to the core work we do the ideas and perspectives and actual physical bodies of young people. I loved the comments that Kyla made last night about her generation's concern that the economy is not serving their needs today. We need to take that so seriously. So the Aspen Institute will now, in perpetuity, always have that youth dimension to a part of everything else we do.
Yeah, and you're also co-creating with the youth. So
Yes.
it's a model for a way of working with young people today.
Well, you've written about this. Ed, nothing about us without us.
Right.
It's critical to our work with Opportunity Youth around the U.S. and around the world on Native American reservations, with urban youth, with school systems, with civic organizations founded by young people, that we foster a sense of active citizenship and growth mindsets among young people. And it's easy to say that and then go about doing the normal work again. What we're seeking to do at the Institute now is to make sure that we can build playbooks and models so that organizations can see how they can involve young people in their core work.
I love that, especially now that we don't really have civic education in the school systems anymore. So critical. Okay, so you both mentioned a little bit about your global reach. I'd love to go into that a little deeper. Andy, talk about the lessons that Prudential has learned in their global workings and how they're applying it domestically, even locally.
So I would say the primary learning that I've personally had at Prudential as I've operated around the globe and had the opportunity to be in Brazil or Japan or India is I would start with just saying what we know is people are people. Yeah. And people love their children, they love their parents, they want to do better financially. Right, so while there's a lot that we talk about how different cultures are and obviously different governmental systems, at the core, the end consumers want to achieve the same things, want to do the same things. So what we've done is we've taken a global approach that we then localize. So we've spent a lot of time and energy trying to create enterprise-wide capabilities where we can leverage and learn across markets. So just two quick examples. The market in Japan, they have a retirement crisis just like we have a retirement crisis. Theirs, I would argue, may be even worse than ours with the aging of their society. What was a vibrant life insurance market is quickly rotating to be a very retirement-oriented, income-oriented market. We've taken all of our expertise and knowledge and success that we've had in the U.S. market, and we're using that and leveraging that with our teams in Japan to develop products more quickly, to develop our customer experiences more quickly, and that's having great success. An example where it went the other direction is we have had really good success in Brazil working with Mercado Libre, which is the Amazon of Latin America, of embedding protective solutions in the purchase paths in the digital platforms of Mercado Libre in a very simple way that's easy to access that customers love. We've taken the talent and that expertise and imported it back here to the United States to develop a simplified set of product solutions where we're now partnering with different firms in the U.S. to expand access to the types of solutions that we offer. So we try and take an enterprise approach to capabilities, but then localize it in our markets.
What about you, Dan? What is your global work? How has it informed what you do locally, and vice versa?
So the Institute works with partners all around the world. As I said, we have the 13 global Aspens in places ranging from India to the UK to Colombia to Japan to probably the most inspiring place to me on the global scene right now, which is Ukraine, where there are 9 people whose jobs are to get up every day in Ukraine and bring people together in subway stations and bomb shelters so that they can talk about the kind of good society they want to have and why is it they are resisting the invasion and the attack that's been going on now for more than a decade. And when you see people doing that, gathering in a subway station so that they can talk together about how to build an economy that works, how to prevent corruption in government, how to promote leadership in young people, you see them doing that there. That is the absolute antidote to cynicism. And that is what we most need here, I believe. People all across this country lowering the temperature, coming together and saying, what do we share and how do we preserve that for our children? So to me, there's much global work we do, but the power and beauty, as you said, of knowing that people are people and allowing ourselves to be imaginatively open to what it is others are doing to take control of their lives is, to me, the calling of great global institutions. Surface what's happening around the world so we can inspire one another.
Oh boy, we need that. We need that now more than ever. Okay, so looking ahead, how do you think about embracing change while remaining committed to the people and communities you serve? So how are you as a leader of these huge institutions sort of coping with the rapid change?
You want to start?
Okay, so first of all, the rate of change is increasing exponentially.
Yeah.
And that is going to create winners and losers. And it may create a lot more losers than winners if a lot more people feel they can't cope with change, adapt to change, or drive change in their lives, whether through the economy or through education or through their personal commitments. We have to acknowledge that the pace of change is so disruptive right now that people are searching for order and stability and meaning, and then respond to that. For the Aspen Institute, that means A, we have to do even more to broaden our aperture, to bring more people into our work, to the conversations that we're having, like this one here today. We cannot be content or complacent that we've gathered up the right groups, we always come together, aren't we great? We've got to go out to all across the country, to younger people, to rural America, to immigrant communities, to the business community. In our case, it's very important that we reach out to conservatives of all backgrounds, many involved, but we should do more. How do we widen our aperture so that we can then have the most rich conversation and sort of convening power that we're able to muster in these times? And the second thing I would say about responding now in a time of change is that we have to be able, as an institution, to listen and be responsive to what's really on people's minds, not to what we who are older may have brought from our youth and young adult times into our maturity. We have to listen because there are new ideas, new frustrations, and new capabilities right now in a collection of assets in this generation of younger people.
So Prudential has not been here 150 years because it stayed the same.
Exactly.
Right? It's been here 150 years because it has changed. And it's often difficult as leadership in an organization because change is hard. Nobody wants to personally change, right? But we have to move more quickly. So we have a whole new set of entrants in the insurance space. A lot of asset management companies have entered. They move extremely quickly. For us to stay relevant, us to stay strong, I call it, there's a hockey analogy, increase our clock speed. But at the end of the day, it's have the best people, have the best culture, stay focused on the end consumer and how their needs are evolving and changing. Japan being a great example where what we did yesterday is not working. We need to change what we're offering. Keep that at the center, keep purpose at the center, but be willing to make hard decisions of doing things differently because the greatest risk that we have is not changing enough and becoming irrelevant.
One thing I learned from the development of Prudential and other major companies is you've always found ways to take assets that were perhaps from different parts of the company and bring them together and link them and leverage them at a moment when that's needed. What we're trying to do across the Institute now is take those 9,000 leaders that have come through all sorts of doorways and create a single interconnected global community where they can connect, give, and grow across the arc of their leadership careers. We're also trying to gather up all of our programs that work on different dimensions of an important issue, like economic inclusion, which means working on community college success, working on public education, working on entrepreneurship, working on corporate responsibility, working on changes to the entry-level jobs so it's a springboard to the middle class. Well, all those efforts that we have in fantastic programs also can be siloed, and it's important for us to be able to connect the leaders that are driving change so that they can have an aggregate effect together. And that's something that the private sector has done, I think, better than the civil society, probably because of being market responsive, or maybe because of the power of collaboration to create a new value for the company. So we're on our journey to follow Prudential and others, I hope, to being a more integrated and connected institution in the years to come.
Well, I know we were talking about institutions, but as I was listening, I was thinking about really the advice that you're talking about for institutions also applies to us as individuals, and that is to listen generously, to listen for genuine needs, listen locally for genuine needs, and then use your assets, your values, your people, your talent to meet those needs. That's how we matter in the future. So grateful to both of you for your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marshall Kozloff. I'm a senior fellow and director of special projects at the Niskanen Center, and I also host the Realignment Podcast. I'm going to have a great conversation with my friend Reihan Salam, president of the center-right Manhattan Institute, discussing politics, culture, and how that relates to economics. I think the really important intro for you, Reihan, here is that the Manhattan Institute is based in New York City. So unlike a lot of center-right institutions, you obviously are engaging in politics, but you're not based in DC, which DC is not usually ahead or engaged with the culture in the same way. So before we get into like a specific issue, like namely immigration, that I think gets at the core of the politics, culture, and economics intersection, I'd love for you just to sort of give your answer to the question of like, why should we be talking about politics and culture at an event centered on the economy?
When you're looking at how elites shape society, you can think of it in terms of three broad dimensions. Elites shape society through formal control of institutions. They shape society through storytelling, through cultural production, and they also shape it through the power of imitation. Ultimately, so much of our economic lives, our political sensibilities, are informed by our narrative self-understanding. Who do we believe ourselves to be? Where do we see ourselves in some larger progression of the family or society? When you think about risk takers, why do they take risks? Why do they make these bold moves? It's oftentimes because of how they see themselves as parents, as children, as people who want to achieve, become visible. And these things are shaped by all sorts of larger cultural currents that have really big, concrete economic implications.
And I think what's interesting, obviously you've written a lot about immigration. You are the children of Bangladeshi immigrants in the 1970s, so you're rooted in this question. And I think immigration is also, just given your expertise, but also like the fact that we're trying to tie together these big, complicated topics, just sort of the perfect intersection. So, with the realignment, I do a lot of work that's focused on how the populist left and the populist right are really assaulting the establishment. They're really, to your point about the stories we tell, when you listen to the populist right and left, they are advancing their political ideas through attacking the received story that the center-right establishment tells, that the center establishment tells, that the center-left establishment tells. So you specifically talk about immigration through the lens of two interesting sort of issues and areas that really expose like these weak points of the story and are going to be tension points moving forward at economics, politics, and cultural levels. So let's start with the New York City mayoral race. And Mamdani, and less the version of the story, which is, hey, Zoran has shown how there are all these upwardly mobile millennials who feel that the city doesn't work for them anymore, and they were really receptive to democratic socialism. You instead are really interested in a sort of undercovered part of that story, which is actually about immigrant communities, working class immigrant communities specifically. Like, let's talk about that.
So when you're looking at working class blue collar immigrants, there is a classic story, which is that you experience upward mobility. You move from one society to another. You have this narrative sense of control over your own fate, of agency. The ultimate act is to disembed yourself from one environment to take yourself to another. That can be very heroic, that can be very taxing, but it's something where you feel powerful. But here's the irony. What happens over time? So when you look at, why is it that cities like New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco are magnets for immigrants, despite the fact they have such an incredibly high cost of living? The reason is that in the early years that immigrants arrive in a country, they send as much as 15% of their income home in the form of remittances. So that means that they're targeting nominal income rather than real income. One way to think about assimilation is that over time, those ties attenuate. Less of your income is going to remittances that you're sending back home. Let's say you're a single male adult who's living in Brooklyn, New York, or in Queens. You're living in an illegal basement dwelling. You are focused every single day. You're riding a delivery bike, something like that. You're doing an extremely dangerous, difficult job for your family back home. As you assimilate over time, you build obligations at home. You are someone who has a different set of what is right and appropriate. Shortly before the Democratic mayoral primary, there's a little piece in the Wall Street Journal in which the journalist was interviewing an older gentleman, a Muslim gentleman in his 60s, an immigrant, who is saying that, I'm struggling. I'm living in a studio apartment. It is not very comfortable. I'm crowded. And it was really striking because, again, we think of that classic plucky immigrant story, the new arrival. They're off to the races. They're in control. They have agency. Then, as the decades go by, suddenly you're someone who's driving a for-hire vehicle, and you're thinking, what is this? What is Waymo? What does this mean? How is the world going to change? How is the fact that I am now here, this is my life, I've been here for decades, how precarious do I feel? Then you think about that person's child. Now, there are, of course, many immigrants who are going directly into the elite, who are already affluent, already established, their kids are already in the kind of very much in the mainstream, in fact, in the elite of the mainstream. But if you're a working class, lower middle class immigrant, and you're someone who works with your hands, or you're behind the wheel of a car every day, then your kid, they went to community college, maybe they have a college degree, they're out there, maybe they're working as a home health aide, maybe they're someone who's climbing the ladder just a bit, but they can't buy a home. So you have this first generation that is naturalized, that is somewhat more assimilated in its expectations for where it ought to be. And then you have the children of those blue-collar migrants who are themselves thinking, where do I fit in? This promise that I was going to be propelled much, much further, it happened in a sense, and yet where do I fit in the wider society? How discontent might I be? That's a really interesting constituency that is not everywhere, but is now being politically mobilized in an interesting and meaningful way. When we think about populism, oftentimes we think about someone in the Rust Belt. We think about an older, multi-generational American, white or black. You're someone who saw the China shock. You lived through it. But what about those people who are going through this other shock that's happening in these big coastal metros where you have immigrant-rich communities, but where, for some, not all, their narrative is not one of uninterrupted, pure upward mobility, but rather of discontent and dissatisfaction?
I'd be curious then, so obviously when we talk about a word like assimilation, it's going to bring to mind that late 19th century, early 20th century story of Eastern Europeans, Jewish, Italian, people from Ireland, they sort of like transition in. How, the key thing about this story though is obviously assimilation isn't just cultural, it's also assimilating into an American economy that seems to be until the Great Depression on the upswing. So to what degree do you think the culture or the expectation of, let's say, the tension point between assimilating into America culturally, but not this economically upwardly thing, how will that impact things?
So this is so fascinating and neglected. When you're looking at immigration in the 19th century, that peak when you're looking at the late 19th century, early 20th century, one story people often forget is that when you look at most immigrant populations, there was always a large number of people who were going back to their native country. If you look at Italian immigrants to the Americas, including to the United States, you had a good 35% of people who went back ultimately to their native country. There were two populations in particular, the Irish and the Jews from Eastern Europe, who came and it was a one-way ticket. And it's funny because when we think about immigrant stories, when we think about the romance of that era, those are the communities that are kind of paradigmatic. So many of the stories are about the assimilation and the battles experienced by both of those groups. So when you're looking at contemporary immigration, it's a very different dynamic for all sorts of reasons. One is that the first immigrants who arrive in a society, they're the pioneers. But then as the enclave grows, that dynamic changes. The 10,000th person to become part of an immigrant enclave is necessarily different. You're not any less virtuous, but there's less of that big cultural risk that you're taking, right? Another thing is that we live in the world of WhatsApp. We live in a world where actually you can maintain certain cultural connections to your native country in a way that was much harder when you're looking at the Irish and the Jews, where they experienced this big rupture. And there's also a deep sense of gratitude that went along with that rupture. Another thing to keep in mind is that even when you look at that period that we look on with a lot of romance, the upward mobility was actually quite limited within the first generation. The big economic gain you were making was going from one society to another. And then, as I mentioned, if you were going back, you could accumulate some wealth that you bring back with you to Italy, let's say, or to Norway, or wherever else. But, The real upward mobility was in the second generation and the third generation. That's where it really, really accelerated. That's where you saw the dramatic gains. So now, when you have a society that is a low fertility society, it's very interesting. There's this kind of interesting cultural clash between people who are thinking of themselves as being part of an intergenerational, multi-generational story versus people who are thinking about themselves. And I don't mean to say that you're being selfish or terrible, but you're thinking about yourself and you're thinking about your own experience. So again, think back to that 60-plus-year-old Bangladeshi Muslim immigrant person who had worked his tail off as a cab driver forever. Living in a studio apartment in Queens with his wife and, feeling a lot of uncertainty about his future and where it's going to go and his family's future and where it's going to go. If you think about your life as, I laid down the foundation for a great American family, and my children and grandchildren are going to reap the benefits of my sacrifice, and my sacrifice is real, my sacrifice of disembedding myself, all of these things. If you look to your children, well, first of all, you don't have grandchildren, but if you're looking to your children as people who themselves feel this very deep sense of discontent, who themselves feel very precarious, that's a way in which your story has not necessarily been vindicated. And I think that is a really interesting development. And that's not new, by the way. This has always happened at other moments in the past. But this is something that I think we've tended to neglect because, of course, I think for good reasons, for noble reasons, we tend to have a really romantic sense of how immigrants renew our national optimism. They renew our sense of hope, and I think that that's real. But that's not always and everywhere necessarily true, and it's also the case that you're going to have political entrepreneurs who will build on that fact, that it's not always and necessarily true. 25% of Americans are first and second generation. This is a huge political force, a huge cultural force, a huge economic force. And rather than look at this as a totally disaggregated population of people who are, feeling such a deep sense of gratitude as my parents did, as I did, you're seeing people who are interacting with a different economic and cultural landscape.
And I think that does a great job of covering this sort of left of center, like populist phenomenon, which you're seeing in the New York City mayoral race results, and obviously that's not going to scale to the country, because to your point, this is a very Los Angeles-centric story, this is a New York-centric story, but I think a story, as someone of like the center-left who sort of studies the right, the story I'm fascinated by, to give another useful case study here, is the debate over H-1B visas, and how very quickly this turns into a cultural story where we sort of, especially in the sort of upper middle class sort of sectors where we talk about immigration in the high school degree, we sort of see there's a real breakdown of consensus that I think rooms like this really need to think about. So it should be noted, realignment, so studying how the right has changed. If you're looking at the immigration debates of the late 2000s or even the 2010s, the generic line would be, if you are a conservative immigration hawk, you would say, I'm not against immigration, I'm against illegal immigration. Or, I really am worried about working class people, especially in the Rust Belt or other competitive places, so I'm worried about like low-skilled wages, that side of the immigration thing. Obviously, I'm still pro-immigration as a whole when it comes to legal immigration, or we should be much more like Canada or Australia and have a point system, like we need these entrepreneurs, the Elon Musk story. What happened very quickly, though, after the 2024 election, though, is you actually saw a major breakdown of that consensus that left people really sort of in a lurch there. And I think the really relevant thing here is that Vivek Ramaswamy, so very Trumpy, millennial who is now running for the governorship of Ohio, at the time he was in talks to co-run Doge with Elon, he specifically was defending the H-1B process and high-skilled immigration, and he specifically said, Americans, you have to work harder to keep up with high-skilled immigrants. And if you have to give up sleepovers, you give up sleepovers. If you have to give up the fun things. And I just remember thinking, in the early 2010s, Amy Chua, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, that was very much sort of the vibe in that moment of time. But as let's say, confidence in the meritocracy, even in the upper middle class, is sort of broken down, and as a young parent myself, I find myself less thinking, I really need my young son to be ready to compete in a globalized economy in 20 years, so no sleepovers. That just doesn't culturally sit well with me.
Yeah.
In a way that Vivek was just not really, I think he was shocked by how vehement the left, right, and center, upper middle classes who he thought were going to be on his side, turned against him. So I'd love for you to bring a lot of context into this.
This is completely fascinating. It's a very uncomfortable subject, but it's something that we need to think about. When you're looking, of course, there are many different populations we're talking about, but a population that's become very visible in this discourse, on the right, to a lesser extent on the left, is the Indian American population in particular. And this is a population that, it's really important to understand, has grown enormously. So this is a group that is now over 1% of the US population, and that is foreign-born, folks who were born in India who are now in the United States, not including their second generation plus descendants. And this is a population that has actually grown enormously since 2010 as well. There has been an Indian origin population in the United States for many, many years, stretching back to the 19th century. But if you're looking at the explosive growth, there was 1965, that was one wave of growth where you had a group of professionals who came. Then you had family reunification, but then the real explosion came in H-1B, with the H-1B visa, the advent of that in the very early 1990s. And what you saw is a population that is triple selected, a population that within India was unusual. They're disproportionately from upper caste backgrounds, very disproportionately, they don't just have higher education, not just bachelor's degrees, but graduate degrees as well. And then the H-1B process, the US skilled immigration system, the way you navigate it, it basically selected for a group that was an unusually well-prepared group to thrive in a knowledge economy. So you have a population that, again, and I'm generalizing a bit, I'm overstating a bit, but a population that is by far the most affluent immigrant population by household income, and a population that, in national terms, 1% doesn't sound huge, but is very visible, very present in the uppermost echelons of American society, and that has become particularly pronounced over the last, call it 10, 15 years. So what's really interesting to me about this phenomenon is that it's happening against this larger backdrop of cultural change. When you're looking at the Jewish experience of upward mobility and rising visibility, that is something that happened over a pretty long period of time. It happened against the backdrop of the trauma of the pogroms and later the trauma of the Holocaust. You had a narrative that was built around gratitude, a sense of gratitude for the blessings of American life, and also a deep commitment to philanthropy. And again, I'm speaking in generalizations. But then in this era, you've had this really huge growth of a population that was not very visible in American life before, that becomes very visible really quickly, and where it's a group that's still being incorporated into American institutions. So when you're thinking about immigration, one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that when we had really big immigrant inflows in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you also had very high native fertility. People were having much bigger families than they do today. Today, native-born Americans have much smaller families. And what that means is that intergenerational differences become much more pronounced. If you are someone who is, call it 65 plus, think about who are your grandchildren. Then think about what is the landscape that I'm seeing in the culture. If you look at California public schools, for example, it's about 30% of those schools are non-Hispanic white when you look at the kind of student population. And again, on a certain level, that's neither here nor there. You can have a lot in common with people who don't look exactly like you. But if you're someone who is, an older person who doesn't have direct personal relationships with people from different backgrounds, why would you? And you're thinking, my grandchildren, how do they relate to this? Or maybe I don't have grandchildren at all. So when I'm looking at younger Americans, rising generations, when I'm looking at the politics of rising generations, I might feel pretty alienated by that, and that might inform how I'm thinking about whether or not I want to invest in that future, how I'm feeling about that future, the conflict that I might fear for the future. And then to Marshall's point about this idea of an upper middle class group that seems to really be very well prepared for ferocious meritocratic competition, and that is not necessarily thinking, hey, I'm actually really, I'm looking up to what I'm finding here. I want my kids to take part in the sleepover, right? I want my kids to take part in these rituals. Maybe what you perceive, fairly or otherwise, is, well, I'm looking at these people who are coming here and who are enormously successful, and they seem to be looking down a little bit on some of my traditions, some of my rituals, some of what I consider to be important. I'm not saying any of this is right. I'm not saying any of this is fair. But when you have a society in which everyone feels very culturally insecure, then that's something that can be really combustible. What do I mean by culturally insecure? I think about the incredible success of Mark Zuckerberg, and then I think about the incredible success of Mark Zuckerberg's dad. Mark Zuckerberg was an orthodontist living in Dobbs Ferry, New York, who was able to lay the groundwork for his son and his children to do these incredible things. There was a time in American society and in Western societies writ large where the family narrative was central. I am laying the groundwork for what comes next. I would argue that we live in a much more narcissistic, narrow society right now. And we live in a society in which there's much more envy and resentment, much more of a sense of, well, where am I fitting in, as opposed to my job is to do that patient work of laying the groundwork for what's to come. And also, when it comes to parenting and grandparenting, the attitude is not, how am I laying the groundwork? The attitude is, I'm going to get mine, to some degree. And I think that leads to, or it contributes to, much more friction, much more conflict. And again, I think that there's a lot of this happening on all sides of the cultural divide, but I think that insecurity comes from the breakdown of cultural transmission. When you're not grounded in whether it's a faith tradition, a historical tradition, some sense of where I've come from and where I'm heading next, you have a lot of confusion, and you'll oftentimes have a lot of anger.
Something I'm curious about for this last section then is, if I think of the Manhattan Institute's politics in its place on the right, I would say you are very part of this pro-meritocracy right, in the sense that you're defending talented and gifted programs. You're sort of, not you personally, but sort of people in your orbit are talking about how we need to bring back standardized testing to higher education, the SAT, admissions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in the backlash to Vivek's comments, I think we just see how at a cultural level, we are just primed for an anti-meritocratic backlash, in the sense of my actual reaction, because do you send your kids to sleepovers? Are they allowed to?
They're only 5 and 6, so not yet.
So they haven't been ruined for global competition yet. So good to see they'll be ready to crush it in the 2040s. But I think from my perspective, my reaction to that whole anecdote was, if young Theo, my son, can only go to UT or Texas A&M because he went to some sleepovers instead of going to Yale or Harvard, at this point, maybe it'd be harder for me to say that in the 2000s, jokes aside, harder to say that in the 2010s, but I think it's much easier to say that, and I think we're at this weird transition point of that. So I'd be curious how you think about this dynamic.
Well, specifically about children and child rearing, I'm totally at sea, and there's so much collective wisdom in this room, I'm sure. But I do have an impulse. And my impulse is, and I'm sure that it's a reflection of my family and my parents and who they were. I just really believe that you want to do difficult things. You want to overcome, you want to foster some resilience, but also you just want to do things that machines can't do. You want to build friends, you want to build relationships, you want to know how to deal with people who, my kids are incredibly difficult kids. And I think that's, so that's going to be a gift to everyone around them, to learn to deal with people like my children. So I think that, but that's my instinct. And when I think about our organization, so much of it is about cultivating that ability to deal with different people, form new relationships. When I think about the right, there are things that are happening right now in the political right, but I'm also thinking about 10, 15 years from now, and what I want to tell my fellow conservatives is, look at where the hockey puck is going. Look at the new America that is emerging. 2/3 of immigrants live in the 20 biggest metro areas in the United States. You cannot write off cities. How are people getting shaped and formed? That is happening in the context of public institutions. When you're thinking about the debates that are emerging, you were saying in New York City and LA right now, those are going to be the national debates. in whether it's 5 years or in 10 minutes. That is absolutely going to be true. So if you are on the right, what I would urge people to do is do not retreat from these environments. Engage. You're going to be in the minority sometimes, but engage, because that's going to be a big part of your future and the country's future.
Excellent place, perfect timing. Raihan, thank you for joining all of us.
Thank you very much.
Good to be with you, Dilip. I've admired you from afar for many years, and here we are. First time we've actually in person.
Yeah, on the couch.
On the couch. We were just commenting, this couch, it looks comfortable. It really isn't. I mean, do we lean back or do we lean forward or, what?
I'm going to have an awkward moment. My back is going to be in pain very shortly, so just don't pay attention.
Hey, so Dilip, I want to know a little bit about you and how you got to be, you're both vice chair and chief economist of PGIM, which is the big investment management firm for Prudential. First question, which is more important, vice chair or chief economist?
Oh, it's a lot of words. I don't know what either means precisely, but I mean, my career path, it's been a non-linear one. Maybe it's been incoherent. That's probably a better word. I've spent about half of my career in public service and half in the private sector. I started out in the tech industry in the late 90s during the dot-com boom. Then I went to Goldman for most of the 2000s when the world hyper-globalized. But then post-financial crisis, I pivoted to public service because I always wanted to make a contribution at a moment that felt consequential and when I had something to say. And it took me about a decade to have something to say. But I raised my hand and joined the Treasury in 2011 to work on Dodd-Frank financial reforms. And then I ran
so we can blame you for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just line them up, all the complaints.
Yeah, right.
I still get them. But it was for me.
No, actually, that was a wonderful piece of legislation, in my humble opinion. A lot of moving parts, but...
We don't have the counterfactual, but I think it's helped us get through a number of stress tests post-2008.
Right.
But I loved it. I worked on Dodd-Frank. I ran our debt management office. I led our engagement with Greece when it was flirting with Euro exit. I designed sanctions against Russia after it invaded Crimea. I only left after the election in 2016 to come back to the private sector. I became a global macro hedge fund investor. And then the New York Fed called right before COVID and said, will you run the markets group? This army of people that implement monetary policy. So I did, and that job involved setting up the emergency facilities that backstop the real economy during the crisis. And then Joe Biden was elected, and Jake Sullivan called and said, will you be my deputy national security advisor for international economics? And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, will you just break down the silos between national security and economic policy and lead our policy efforts at that intersection? And now I'm back here after another election.
Wow.
And yeah, so I'm vice chair.
Very cool.
Elections tend to matter in my career. No, my job here is...
Well, you're in the desert right now.
Well, so. I feel pretty comfortable here. This is a nice couch. My job is to connect the dots for our clients, to help them do that, and for them to help me do it as well.
I see.
Between economics, geopolitics, and financial markets. So I'm trying to see the world as clearly as possible. I'm not trying to shape the world as it should be. I'm trying to see the world as it is and how it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you and I use the lens of economics to see the world clearly, but sometimes it's through the lens of geopolitics or politics. Increasingly, it's technology. And what I see is definitely colored by where I've been, because I came of professional age at the high watermark of the post-Cold War international order, the so-called end of history. And so what I saw in the 90s was low inflation, expanding global supply chains, rising capital flows, technological diffusion, the ascendance of democracy and multilateralism. And it seemed like a permanent feature of the world economy. And then it fell apart. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how did we get here and where are we going?
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, here we are, the global economy. Maybe I'll just characterize it in my own words and throw it back at you and see what you think.
Okay.
Obviously, the global economy is a big place. There's a lot of moving parts. Some parts of the world doing a lot better than other parts of the world. But if you take a look at the global economy in its totality, it's growing. It's not in a recession, but it feels uncomfortable. It's just not growing to its potential. And that potential rate of growth is throttling back because of what's going on. But but it's a struggle, a bit of a struggle. I'd say that's what I characterize the U.S. economy as being and the global economy as being. Is that fair?
We call it a muddle through. Yeah,
a muddle through.
We're slightly below the long-term trend of growth, and we have high and sticky inflation. And I think we're in a different regime. And economists, we look at we used to have high-frequency data. We don't right now. But, we tend...
He's referring to the government shutdown.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Geeky economist talk.
Yeah. Although we get a data point on Friday, we get the consumer price index.
God bless.
God bless, yes.
It's easy for us to miss regime shifts, and so we're no longer in the post-Cold War post-Cold War unipolar moment that underpinned the great moderation of the global economy for 30 years. I think everybody understands that we're in a different geopolitical regime. Both Russia and China have expressed and revealed a desire to challenge the US-led order. They both have the capacity to do so in different ways and especially in coordination with each other. The US and its allies are pushing back, but there's a large and growing number of what I call geopolitical swing states that are hedging their bets and trying to carve out a non-aligned path. So think of India or Indonesia or Saudi, UAE, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil. So we're in a new regime, I think, with much more uncertainty. You mentioned struggle, but yeah, uncertainty and struggle are part of it. I think we're going to have less scope for cross-border cooperation to manage cross-border risk, like a pandemic, or like climate change, or like food insecurity, energy insecurity, debt distress. And we're going to have a higher likelihood of conflict. And here's how I connect the dots. I mean, if it's the case that we're back in a world of great power competition, well, most of today's great powers are nuclear powers. And so the risk of mutually assured destruction, I think, is channeling direct conflict between great powers away from the battlefield and into the theater of economics, because confrontation is not existential. So then what does that mean for the steady state? That's the question for us as economists. What's the steady state for the economy? How fat are the tails for financial markets? And I think we'll look back and see that about a decade ago, we had a structural break in the regime. The anchors on growth, on inflation, on risk premia, on interest rates, they've loosened. Because monetary policy, fiscal policy, regulatory policy, foreign policy, they're all in flux at the same time. Okay, so central banks, they're not the only game in town. They're increasingly taking their orders from political authorities. Political authorities are ushering in an era of fiscal dominance, right, to finance defense spending and industrial policy. They're deploying economic weapons to a degree that we've never seen before to break bonds in the global economy or to threaten doing so for geopolitical advantage. And then democracies themselves, political authorities, are coming apart at the seams from polarization that we haven't seen in a century. And if you have less weight in the political center, you're going to have less centrist economic policy, a general disregard for deficits, more erosion of institutional norms, and less policy credibility. To me, that's the new steady state, and it feels uncomfortable. But I don't think it necessarily means that every geopolitical risk is a market shock. Coming back to the private sector, I think we need a new taxonomy for how we think about what geopolitical risks actually create a fat tail for financial markets. My working hypothesis, they're the risks that are new. They're the ones that are quantifiable, potentially nonlinear in terms of their impact on the major economies of the world. And they don't have a readily available policy offset to the shock itself. So that, to me, it helps explain why markets responded so sharply to the step change in tariff announcements in April, and sadly, so little to the erosion of our institutional norms, which are much harder to quantify and not quite so new anymore.
So just to take what you said, and there's a lot to unpack there, and kind of put it into my own words, it feels like what you're saying is that, look, for a number of decades, certainly between 1990 and, let's say, the global financial crisis in the 2008, 2009, that period, that almost 20-year period, and in the middle of that period, China entered into the World Trade Organization, and that's when it really came onto the scene in a very big way. That period was a period of globalization.
Hyper-globalization.
What you call hyper-globalization, right? And you have this great chart that you show where you just take exports plus imports. This is for the U.S. Exports plus imports divide by GDP and take a look at that, and it just is pretty much straight up during that 20-year period.
Yeah, it inched up slowly after World War II, and then it exploded after 1990.
Right.
It doubled.
In 1990, that's in your work. It seems to be an important date because that's kind of when the Soviet Union kind of fell apart. Is that kind of
that was the beginning of this post-Cold War unipolar moment that I think really did underpin the moderation of inflation, created steady growth, and gave us a sense that there was some kind of permanence to this.
Right.
But there wasn't.
Okay, and so then we get up to the GFC, the global financial crisis. Obviously, a lot of dislocation, rethinking of lots of different things. Dodd-Frank being an example of rethinking the banking system, the financial system more broadly. And then President Trump's first term, that trade war and those tariffs, and that was a key point in time also because President Obama had the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a free trade deal with Pacific Rim nations that excluded China because they weren't playing fair. That never got passed. That got blown up in President Trump's first term. Yeah. And since then, it's been a process of what I would call, it feels like to me, deglobalization.
Sure. I call it slowbalization, but sure.
Because if you go back to that chart, you look at exports plus imports divided by GDP, there's a straight flat to down, since then.
Agreed.
And in my thinking, policy now is just reinforcing that deglobalization. The tariffs are a good example of that. Highly restrictive immigration policy, the export, and I'm not making a comment on is it good or it's bad, it's just what it is.
It is what it is.
Right, sanctions, export control, controls on investment, all that. And it's not just the United States now, it's the entire global economy doing this. And I guess my question to you is, this feels like a massive sea change in the way we're organized globally, but yet here we are, we're still growing. It's not like this was a cliff event. Yeah. How do you square that?
You drink a lot of wine. But the thing is, I think we have been here before. I think we're going to probably talk about this all day. I spend a lot of time thinking about the pre-World War I era between 1870 and 1914. That marked the first wave of globalization. Okay, and Keynes wrote poetically in terms of capturing this spirit. He said, I can sip my morning tea in bed, order all the products of the earth by telephone, invest in any quarter of the globe, travel to any country without passport, and regard this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent. And at the same time, we had revolutionary technology.
Keynes said that?
He wrote that.
He wrote that, like 1940 something, or?
It was his postscript to World War I, Economic Consequences of the Peace.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and at the same time, the technological changes were revolutionizing our way of life. The railroad, electrification, the internal combustion engine, telephone, telegraph. And then together you had globalization and innovation creating enormous, extraordinary amounts of wealth. But that wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. The oligarchs of that era, we know their names. They're still plastered on the plazas and buildings of New York. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, no offense to J.P. Morgan. And, that kind of extreme inequality fueled populism. Populism increasingly expressed itself as nationalism. Nationalism intensified geopolitical rivalry between established powers and rising powers. And eventually it collapsed the brittle balance of power in 1914 and triggered a chain of catastrophes for the subsequent 40 years. Does any of that sound familiar?
Yeah.
It does to me. The point is, we have been here before. Now we're living in the aftermath of another wave of, I call it hyperglobalization, and the crest of a new one from technological change. And so we're witnessing another super cycle of innovation, wealth creation, inequality, populism, nationalism, geopolitical rivalry. And if I look at, you asked about markets, which is almost kind of like a mundane question in that context, but it's a good one because it's what, we have to do. In that period, the old normal, I call this the old normal, not the new normal. You had extended bull market runs for years, decades, and then they were punctuated by panic, financial panic, and political upheaval. And there was a systematic unwillingness or inability to price and consider tail risks. And that fed a very dangerous complacency. So I think, the challenge now, we do have these markets that keep going up and up and up. The important thing is cultural. think in terms of probabilities and scenarios, not a point estimate around a single base case, and focus very much on the tails. What could go wrong? Pressure and probe the base case. Attack lazy narratives. Search for our own blind spots. We've all got them. And I just think this is going to be another one of those moments, just like back then, in which you'll be rewarded for humility, for curiosity, for listening more than talking. And it'll reward those who are willing to learn from the past and imagine the future, right? It's going to punish those who are confidently asserting this time is different and we can just reflexively extrapolate the recent past forever.
Okay, so what it sounds like you're saying is, look, markets haven't reacted, the economy is still hanging together.
And they won't react.
But it will be punctuated by, as you said, periods of crises.
Yeah, because I think they price what they can quantify. And they're not going to be an early warning signal for democracy either. They're not a morality tale. So don't expect markets to be your guardrail.
Okay, so here we are, stock market's going straight up, feels like. Valuations are very high in the markets.
Yep.
By some measures, not quite as high as in the Y2K bubble, but we're getting into that kind of neighborhood. How do you feel about that? Is this are we getting close to one of those periods of crises? I mean, this is why you get paid the big bucks, right?
I think this can go on.
It can go on.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'll make it personal. I'm really awful at identifying triggers, but I can see vulnerabilities. I mean, I see so many parallels from today's crypto complex and the 2006 subprime moment. A lot of good money chasing after intrinsically bad assets that are getting leveraged, increasingly finding their way in the balance sheet of systemically important institutions. What could go wrong?
Right, okay. Dilip promised me we're going to end on a positive note. We will get to that shortly. It's not going to last very long.
That was my positive.
Okay, all right. But I am a careful consumer of your work. And you actually wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs.
Thank you.
It was that kind of lays out the argument. And you spent most of the piece on how do we kind of avoid the worst of the fallout from the way this thing seems to be going. As you say, we're going from a unipolar time to a period where there's all kinds of conflict that we're going to suffer, a lot of tension in markets. What kind of policies should we be thinking about or implementing to kind of avoid that kind of darker outcome?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I don't think 1914 is our destiny.
And just to be clear, that's when World War I started, and you're saying that World War I was the culmination of the Second Industrial Revolution, 1870 all the way up through 1913, and that's a very similar period, and therefore, if you're using history as a guide to understanding the future, that doesn't augur well, but that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah, precisely, because I mentioned the super cycle we're in now between innovation, wealth creation, inequality, populism, nationalism, geopolitical rivalry that ends in catastrophe. That was the same sequence back then. So the question is, are we going to sleepwalk into another 1914 moment? And again, I don't think there's anything preordained about this. We have choices to make, and I am genuinely, not for the sake of pretending, optimistic. I do like our chances. One of America's superpowers is the capacity for self-correction. When I read American history, what I visualize is a double helix, of excess and reform, fragility, renewal. You called it the Second Industrial Age, others call it the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era. Progressive, like not in a political sense, but that's the name. And during that era, we amended the Constitution 4 times in 7 years to create an income tax, to create the country's first labor protections, to give voting rights to women, to provide for the direct election of senators. We created the Fed because we've been in a boom-bust cycle roughly once a decade preceding 1913.
1913, the Fed was put on the planet. Right, good
exactly
point.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have the capacity to rewrite the social contract at home. I think the mistake of 1914 was We did not lead and shape a stable equilibrium abroad. So I think if we learn the lessons of that catastrophe, we're not destined to repeat it. I do think right now, though, we need to have the same level of ambition as existed in the early 1900s, deep structural reforms to restore trust in our democratic foundations. I mean, big, but also simple ideas that have broad bipartisan support. We have a 95% incumbency rate in this country for federal elections. Why don't we end gerrymandering and replace it with independent redistricting? We have orders, thank you.
He's got a website collecting donations for his campaign.
I am not running for anything. I'm very happy in my day job. No, I mean, these are not my ideas, but they're very simple. End gerrymandering. Overturn Citizens United and provide for public financing. You know, we spend orders of magnitude more in politics. Money in politics in this country is orders of magnitude greater than any other advanced country. Why is that? You know, term limits on Supreme Court justices. Make Election Day a federal holiday. Is that so crazy? Maybe we should limit presidential pardons. Both sides have abused it. That's the truth. You know, but I think we have to have an equally ambitious agenda. This is what I wrote the piece about on the international front. You know, I think we need a doctrine of economic statecraft. We've spent hundreds of years in this country creating and refining doctrine for the use of military force. But if we're in this global competition in which it's going to happen mostly in the theater of economics, shouldn't we also have limiting principles for the use of economic force so we avoid a race to the bottom? So I do think limiting principles on why, when, how, to what extent, and against whom we deploy economic weapons is timely. Sanctions, export. I mean, I helped freeze the assets of Russia, $300 billion worth.
Right.
And that's kind of the nuclear option in the economic realm. We need to have limits.
But Dilip, we can't even keep the lights on in the government. So, I mean, how realistic is this? Yeah. I mean, our politics are fractured. And it doesn't feel like there's any middle ground here. And the kinds of things you're talking about, I mean, they require some compromise on both sides. It just doesn't feel likely.
I think reform and renewal are very difficult absent crisis.
Right.
But, you know, the
absent crisis.
Especially absent a crisis, even during a crisis, but especially outside of one. But I sense a real hunger out there. And what do I know? I just look at polls, and I see people saying that, you know, they feel like everything is still broken. They're deeply worried about the future, especially for their kids. They feel the American dream slipping further away. They're tired of dysfunction and division, really tired. And so the demand signal's there. You know, let's put it back in terms of supply and demand. There is a demand, a hunger for change. And I think moments of renewal, they don't come in a straight line. Like who predicted Barack Obama in 2008? But I do think if the appetite for change reaches a crescendo, I mean, I think what we can do as concerned citizens, that's all I am, is to be ready with ideas and energy and ambition to meet the moment.
You know, I give a lot of talks to my. I have a similar kind of job at Moody's and speak to a lot of business and business executives and boards and investors. And you know, my talks kind of are sort of like yours, kind of dark. And then I come to the end, and I don't want to end on a dark note because, you know, I feel like our history is consistent with being optimistic and success. In fact, there's a quip, I think it's by Winston Churchill. Someone can chat GPT it just to make sure if it's correct. Winston Churchill said something to the effect that, you know, Americans, they try everything and then they ultimately do the right thing. And I firmly believe that. But based on my much more limited experience working in Washington, I sense the same.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Dilip. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've heard that you are soon going to be leaving your job. And before we dive into American Dream, tell us, how are you feeling about that? Wistful, excited?
3 months to go. Proud of the journey that we've been on, but we still have a lot of work to do. The job, the responsibility, the position of a lifetime. So mixed emotions, to say the least.
What one thing are you looking forward to about not being governor?
Yeah, that's a great, I haven't thought about that. I think having some time by myself.
Yeah.
It's very, I've got a small army of people that follow me around, and at a certain point you want to be able to, have a scotch at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and not feel like the world's looking at you.
It's obviously different because he wasn't in office, but there's that lovely documentary about Mitt Romney and his 2012 presidential campaign, and the scene at the end when he and Ann Romney get back to their house, and it's just them.
It's just
and
them.
That's what I imagine you will have.
I will have that. I'll give you one other quote from one of my great predecessors, Brendan Byrne, where you used to go see the Devils play.
Yes.
Brendan was asked, how do you know you're no longer governor? In his answer, which is a classic only in New Jersey, because people start waving at you with all 5 fingers. How true is that, right?
May I wish that for you.
In fact, I'm a little surprised the state bird is not up here on stage with us.
Okay, so so it is clear that it's the thing you are most likely to get a one-finger wave involved. It's clearly the thing that Americans are most worked up about both parties, is affordability, right? It helped drive our presidential election last year. It's helping drive Donald Trump's approval ratings lower now. We're just putting a chart up on screen that's showing that just home prices, which basically shows that it takes more income today, more years of income today to afford a home than it used to. I'm 52. It was harder for my generation to buy a home than it was for my parents. It's a lot harder for the generation after me to buy a home than it is for mine. So can you just, in a really big picture way, and we'll drill down a little bit, but in a big picture way, can you talk about how you think we got here as a society in which so many Americans feel frustrated that they can't afford the things they want?
All good. Can I say 2 things, just a point of personal privilege? Number 1, it's a big deal that Aspen Ideas is in Newark.
Please.
And, right? Not just in this august hall, but you guys were out in bars and restaurants and running through parks and really living the brick city, so number 1. Number 2, Dan Porterfield and I are both hanging up our cleats next year. Me in January, he next summer. He's done an extraordinary job at Aspen, so I wanted to make sure I said that. So David, the lens that I look at that question through, obviously, is mostly New Jersey.
Yes.
And I don't think there's any one reason. COVID, stimulus certainly has got to be part of it. I'm not a tariff guy. I think tariffs are inflationary, and I think we're starting to see evidence of that. You've got far too much dismantling of programs in Washington whose very existence are for the folks who have nowhere else to turn, and in many cases helps them afford things like health care, SNAP, food stamps, if you will, WIC, women and infant children. So there's a lot of safety nets that are getting yanked. So I would argue the mothers and fathers of the inflationary affordability challenge today are many. One of them in New Jersey, it's ironically, it's the flip side of what is a success story right now. So meaning we have more people living here than ever before, more people employed than ever before, more businesses in operation than ever before. All of that's really cool. We're a hot state. We love that. We're an innovation economy. People are coming here, but boy, it puts a big strain on energy prices, home prices, school seats, roads that are in good repair, mass transit that works for everybody. So I'll pick homes just for a second. So what have we done? We've focused on both the supply side and the demand side. On the demand side, we have a first-time home buyers program we've had in place since 2022. I think 10,000 families have bought homes through that. We have massive property tax relief for both homeowners and renters. Really juicy if you're means tested under a certain level, and even better yet if you're a senior. We're trying, but you asked me about my gun lap here. We're trying to get zoning and permitting reform. So doing a lot of things, and then signed last year a landmark bill to build a significant amount more of affordable housing units. So it's not one, like a lot of things in life these days, you would think in the political discourse would lead you to one reason, one soundbite, and it's almost never that. It's always complicated how we got here, affordability or any other policy challenge, and complicated and multi-dimensional in terms of how you get out of it.
Do you think it's fair to say that one of the things the Democratic Party should be most introspective about is some of these issues, that in blue America, things have just gotten so expensive? It's an issue in red America as well.
Yeah.
But when I spend time in Florida and Texas, boy, do I feel like I drive past more new construction than I do in Maryland, where I live, or in New York, where I grew up.
I don't think you'd feel that way in Jersey.
Okay.
And I'm not throwing shade on either New York or Maryland, but we have a lot of housing stock getting built again because I signed this landmark bill, and we have a significant appetite for home ownership. Although the rental market, not surprisingly, in the absence of an ability to own a home, the rental market has exploded. I think, and this is not necessarily time for a political discussion, I think your thesis had more heft 6 months ago than it does today, because I think the Trump administration is now at the head of the class contributing to the inflationary reality that we're in. I would argue through tariffs principally. All the talk about the Federal Reserve's independence or lack thereof is hugely unsettling. This is beyond affordability, just an observation. Too many of our norms, too many of our institutions are being called into question, being undermined. There's an unprecedented amount of volatility. That leads to a lot of uncertainty, a lot of economic anxiety, and affordability challenges that get exacerbated.
And there's another thing I think contributing to prices, which is we've had so much of a pullback on clean energy. Now, even if you don't care about clean energy from a climate perspective, clean energy is part of an all-of-the-above energy strategy, and we're kind of going in the opposite direction.
We're not immune to that. Listen, I'm a proud progressive and a cold-blooded capitalist. That's where I am on the spectrum. And take energy prices, take offshore wind in particular. When you've got a supply-demand imbalance, as we do right now in energy, in terms of not enough new power sources being built, and the demand that I mentioned a few minutes ago is largely for good reasons. We're a hot place. People want to be here. Businesses want to be here. One of our big multinationals announced a multi-billion-dollar investment program yesterday. Just as one example, that's all good, but you have to bring that supply demand into balance. And so again, I'm not trying to sound too partisan here, but just as a factual matter, the one thing you don't want to do if you've got a supply demand imbalance is take a bunch of supply off the table. And the Trump administration has said, for whatever reason, I'm frankly not sure I understand why, they've taken 11.5 gigawatts of offshore wind off the table, at least paused, for my guess is some number of years. That is only going to add to the challenges. Now, we've exploded solar. We're leading the nation on storage. We're re-examining nuclear again. This needs to be an all-of-the-above moment, including all of the elements of clean energy, and I just wish that we had more wind at our back out of Washington.
One more thing on affordability, and then let's talk a little bit about some other things. To someone, let's imagine a younger voter, someone in her 20s or 30s, who said, I just have lost faith in the government's ability to do things that will materially improve my life and my chances of building the life I want. What would you say to that person?
This is a big deal right now. I'm the former U.S. ambassador to Germany. And there's a big piece in the FT today. I apologize, not the New York Times.
No, I'm all for supporting independent media.
And it's a profile of Friedrich Merz, who is a good friend, who's the chancellor. And Germany's got this issue in a big way because the far right is lurking at the doorstep, the so-called AfD. We've got that in America right now. We have to prove that government can work for you. I'm proud of a lot of the stuff we've done. I think inclusive growth is the buzzword, or the buzz phrase. It cannot be that just a few people, again, you guys have written great stuff on this recently, but there's a gap now between where the consumption is coming between the very wealthy and the rest of our society. And that's going to lead to tears. That does not end well. So inclusive growth, where people have the job they want. Your comment earlier, David, about the American dream of owning that house, that your kids will have that shot, that they'll be able to provide for themselves, covered insurance, send their kids to college, all of that. I think the holy grail is inclusive growth. We've in New Jersey thrown a whole bunch of stuff up on the wall, everything from film and television to all-time high investment in infrastructure, to everything, the innovation economy I mentioned. And I'll tell you, there's another element that I would argue is part of the solution to that dilemma, and that's the U word. Unions matter, particularly at times of anxiety like today, right? It gives you a feeling of community, that you're all in this together. There's safety in numbers, that we can get more as a group that I can as an individual. I think we need to reassert that notion in our sort of solution mix to this very legitimate question.
The way I often talk about unions, and I've been publicly self-critical, saying in my early years as an economic journalist, I don't think I wrote enough about the importance of unions. To people who are skeptical of unions, do you think unions are flawed? Yes, unions are flawed. You know what else is flawed? Corporations. Yeah. And we need flawed unions and flawed corporations
what isn't flawed,
to
right?
check each other. Let's spend a few minutes on education, which I know is a huge priority of yours. Yep. I just feel like every several months some report comes out that leaves me deeply anxious about the state of our country in terms of education. So a few months ago it was the NAEP scores, which showed that we've actually gone backwards in reading and math, which is just a shocking thing. It's also been some of the data on attention and people's ability to focus. And so it feels like we've just come out of this 10 to 15 years. Well, we haven't come out of it. We've had 10 to 15 years in which first the distractions from the phones, which continue, compounded by COVID and often very long school closures, have actually set us backward. How concerned are you, and how can we recover?
Concerned for sure. Those are two of the big contributors. I'm not going to tear my rotator cuff patting ourselves on the back here, but it is a fact. We just got ranked again, New Jersey that is the #1 public education system in America. So we're...
Who was that? Who did that?
U.S. News and World Report. They're not the only ones that rank us either #1 or in the top handful every year. We're incredibly proud of that. So I think you're right in terms of the big X factors contributing this. How do we push back against it? Again, complex challenge, got here for a number of reasons, not going to get out of this with one simple magic wand, one simple soundbite. So for us at least, it's all-time record funding of public education, K through 12, a huge multi-billion-dollar aggressive expansion of pre-K. So we have about, shamelessly fishing for applause up here. We probably have about coming up to half of our districts that have full-day pre-K. Just launched a pilot yesterday in Camden, focused on 3- and 4-year-olds to much more proactively get inside of their lives and anticipate maybe some of the challenges that they'll have to make sure that they're kindergarten ready. I'm a huge proponent of a bell-to-bell ban on cell phones, which we're trying to get done in the lame duck
And just to spend a minute on that, bell to bell means that kids are not using it at lunch either.
You show up at 7:40 in the morning, you put it in a pouch, and you pick it up again at 2:55 in the afternoon.
And what do you say to anxious parents who say, I need to be able to reach my kid?
So without getting into the details, I've visited a bunch of districts that have done this. I've spoken to a bunch of folks, not just visiting, but by telephone and Zoom. There are ways around it. There are ways that are in fact working, and I'm convinced that we can address that anxiety. Phonics, by the way, huge emphasis now in New Jersey on phonics. High impact tutoring is working. Again, no one answer. It's not only money. We've got the best educators on the planet. That's a huge part of this. It takes a village. This is the ultimate. It takes a village.
And do you think we need to do things basically to treat both COVID, but also the fact that we've just had these 10 or 15 years where we really haven't taken seriously the effect of phones? Do you think we need to do something over the next few years, whether it's sending more kids to summer school, whether it's more tutoring, essentially to have a focused intervention to say that we need to do some catch-up, even if it's not permanent?
I think we have to be at least open-minded to that. On COVID, there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking. You're looking back and saying, gosh, those schools were closed for a long time. Believe me, in the moment, when you're focused on the potential of kids dying, it wasn't as black and white in the fall of 2020 as it looks in the fall of 2025, just as an aside. I think we have to be open to all that. I mentioned I was our ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany. Our kids are now in their 20s, but they were 12, 10, 8, and 6 when we went over there. The first few weeks, there was a lot of dinner table conversation. My God, they go to school a lot more days here than they did back home. They start in the middle of August. They go to the late June. I think we got to be thinking about. I mean, the learning loss over summer. It's well documented. Research is unambiguous about that. Should we be doing something about that, at least on a temporary basis? I think it's got to be on the list of consideration.
And where are you on this question of whether, on the amount of choice that families should have in terms of where they send their kids? So first of all, where are you in this idea of universal vouchers? And then where are you on charter schools?
Not a voucher guy.
Because?
Because it drains money out of the public pot. Charters don't. And charters, you got to manage the charter reality really carefully, but I'm not a label guy. If you're districts, if you're educating our precious kids and maximizing their God-given potential, I'm a lot less interested if you're a district, a magnet, a charter. This city is, by the way, the Brick City has got a lot of top performings of all of the above. You've got some of the best performing charters in the country here. You've got some great district schools. You've got some great magnet schools, to pick 3 categories. But I don't like pulling money out of the system. I've never been a fan of that, and I don't think I'll be convinced otherwise. Again, maybe a different state with different circumstances, but as I sit here, when you've got the #1 public education system in America, I think part of my job is to not screw it up.
Yeah. So many people are really worried about the level of polarization in our society. People on both the right and left are worried. They tend to blame the other side for the polarization, but people all across the spectrum are worried. And I wonder if we can just end by talking about, based on your experience as a governor and looking around and working with your fellow governors from both parties, can you give us a little bit of a kind of hopeful scenario of how we might get to a future in which we're less angry with each other? And I'll just throw in one thing, and then you feel free to leave it, or I actually think the cell phone bans offer me a little bit of optimism, because I could have almost the same conversation with you about them that I would have with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor of Arkansas. And so are there issues like that, unlike some of the others, that can get us to see that actually as Americans we really do have more in common than
Amen. So cell phone, I think in particular bell-to-bell bans have huge bipartisan support. I hope we have more issues than that, but I know that one is.
I do too.
I know that one is on the list. Secondly, I mentioned earlier, I think inclusive growth, where it touches everybody. I mentioned unions, I think, are a big part of that, but making sure that we do not have a scenario, which I fear we're in at the moment, where some are doing incredibly well while the rest are not doing well at all, that the anxiety is focused almost entirely in that 80 or 90% block of our society. I'll tell you one really encouraging experience I've had as governor is I've been an active member of the National Governors Association. I've chaired that organization. It's the bipartisan governors organization, as distinct from the Democratic Governors Association, which is hyper partisan, or the Republican Governors Association, likewise hyper partisan. By the way, I'm the first guy ever to chair the NGA and the DGA at the same time, and I know why that's never happened before, because you've got one email list, which is kumbaya, the other one is, I'm going to rip your throat out. And if you ever cross that, you blow the whole place up. But the NGA has been a place of really impressive common ground. And I'll give you a shout out to a Republican. By the way, Kevin Stitt, Republican governor of Oklahoma, is its chair, a really good guy. His wife has, by the way, Jersey family, which is cool. But he's doing a great job. Wes Moore, Democrat, is the vice chair. Wes was just in Newark a couple of days ago, in fact. When I was chair, by the way, Asa Hutchinson was chair when I was vice chair. It goes back and forth. Asa, Republican governor at the time from Arkansas. Great friend, great leader. Again, you're not going to agree on everything. You got to accept, you're going to have to park a fair amount of issues. You know, we're not going to get to kumbaya on reproductive freedom at the National Governors Association, but you can get to kumbaya on a lot of other stuff. And the guy I want to give a shout out to, when I was chair, my vice chair was Spencer Cox of Utah, who has distinguished himself incredibly over the past, whatever is it now, 6 weeks since Charlie Kirk was killed. And this is the guy who's basically pleading, his big mantra is disagree better. Don't feel like we have to convince each other to find the common ground always, because that's not going to happen. But can we find a way as a country, as elected officials, to disagree better, civilly, respect the other person's opinions? The NGA has been a particularly source of that sort of bipartisan, let's figure this out together. And again, along with cell phone bans, I hope those aren't the only two examples 5 years from now you and I cite. I hope that's the beginning of a trend.
Well, I really appreciate where you took that, because some of it is about agreeing, right? Cell phone bans.
Yeah.
But Governor Cox has said that he deliberately put the word disagree first in his disagree
Correct.
better, because that's what a democracy is about. If we all agreed, it wouldn't be a democracy.
100%. And again, it's don't confuse those 2 points, folks. There are things we can agree on, but there's going to be a whole long list where we're not going to agree. But that should be okay as long as we deal with that with respect across the aisle, across one human to another.
I was going to ask you to sing some Wayne Newton tunes, but we are out of time.
There's about 3 people left in this building who know what that song is, but I appreciate your support.
Congratulations on your tenure, Governor.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you for doing
Appreciate
this.
it. Thank you all.